He was not born in sunlight. He was born in dust and darkness, deep beneath the burning sands of Korriban, where the dead whispered louder than the living, where memory was a wound that never healed, a child without a name, a shadow without a past, and the galaxy never noticed. This is the story of Darth Chratis, the silent hammer of the Sith, the master who forged legacies from fear, and who began his life buried under stone, before the power, before the title, before anyone dared speak his name. He was only a boy, small, quiet, watching the Sith turn bones into legends. The acolytes did not call him student. They called him labor, hands for moving stones, eyes for reading ancient warnings, feet for walking the tombs no one else dared enter. His first lessons were not taught with words. They were taught with heat, with hunger, with silence so heavy it felt like a force power. Korriban was a world that punished weakness. The suns offered no mercy. The wind stripped flesh from bone, and the tombs swallowed voices whole. Down there, the boy learned his first truth. Screaming meant nothing. Obedience meant survival. The acolytes never explained the deaths. They simply stepped over corpses and kept walking. The boy watched, always watched. He saw how fear controlled even the strong, how the weak disappeared without ceremony, how the Sith treated life like currency. It was his first education, given without kindness, absorbed without question. At night, when the tombs cooled, he slept on stone. The walls around him held carvings older than the Jedi Order. They showed kings wearing masks, masters binding monsters with chains of will, warriors who ruled through terror and faith. He traced those carvings with dirt-covered fingers, dreaming of power he could not yet name. He did not know the Force. He only knew the quiet, and the quiet was cruel. Sometimes the ground trembled. Sometimes screams echoed through corridors. Sometimes nothing happened at all. That was always the worst, because nothing meant someone died without sound. Korriban was the cradle of the Sith, not by history, but by cruelty. The boy learned to move like a whisper, to carry tools without clatter, to listen for footsteps behind him, because being noticed meant being tested, and being tested meant someone else would die. He survived by shrinking into the walls, by letting others take the punishments, by learning which masters hated questions, and which ones enjoyed watching fear grow. One master in particular watched the boy, never speaking, never intervening, only watching. The boy felt his gaze like a chain, heavy, cold, inevitable. Yet the master never chose him for trials, never beat him, never dismissed him. Instead, the boy was allowed to stay close to the tombs, closer than students with names or parents, closer than warriors carrying training swords, close enough to feel the dead breathing behind stone. He did not understand it, but the master did, because power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the boy listened. In time, he would learn the names carved in the tombs: Ahunta Pau, Tulak Hord, Kali, marks of ancient blades and forgotten kings. Their stories seeped into the dust he inhaled, into the water he drank, into the dreams that woke him shaking. He did not choose the Sith. Korriban chose him, and it never let go. Not then, not ever. This was where the shaping began. In the dark, he was not trained. He was conditioned. Every command was followed without hesitation. Every mistake punished with silence. Silence was worse than pain. The Sith didn't shout. They didn't explain. They watched and waited and let the fear do the rest. When food was withheld, no one complained. When a student vanished, no one asked. The boy learned quickly. Questions were a weakness. Curiosity was a death sentence. He wasn't given a saber. He was given a bone, told to carve his name into stone. Only later did he understand. It wasn't the carving that mattered. It was the bleeding. Pain was part of the process, not an obstacle, a tool. He watched older acolytes fail, not in combat, but in discipline. A single glance could doom you. A single gesture could mark you for isolation, or worse, attention. He stayed beneath notice, moving like smoke through the stone halls, always watching, always learning. The Force wasn't a gift. It was a threat, something that pulled the weak toward madness. He didn't reach for it. He let it surround him, let it smother him, until it became a part of his breathing. He never asked to be trained. He simply survived longer than those who did. The masters began to notice, not because he was strong, but because he was still there. One evening, a girl screamed during meditation. She clutched her head, collapsing to the floor. Her blood turned black in seconds. Poison in the air, placed there on purpose. A test. The boy had smelled it hours before, and said nothing. The masters didn't punish him. They rewarded him. With silence, with one word spoken in passing. Clever. That word stayed with him longer than any lesson. He began to understand. This place didn't care about power. It cared about patience, about precision, about pain without noise. The ancient Sith believed in struggle, but not chaos. Control was everything, and control meant watching the world burn and never blinking. One night, a rival tried to slit his throat while he slept. The blade cut skin, but not deep enough. The boy didn't cry out. He waited until morning, then left the attacker's body hanging from a chain. No blood, no wounds, just eyes wide open, and a message carved into the wall. I saw you first. After that, no one touched him. They whispered a name behind his back. Not his true name, but a title, the Still One, because he didn't flinch, didn't tremble, didn't sleep. And the Sith began to take interest. The deeper tombs were open to him, corridors forbidden to others, rooms where screams had been etched into stone. In one, he found a statue of a figure in chains, lips sewn shut, eyes gouged, hands open, offering nothing. He stood before it for hours. He didn't know its name, but he understood it. Pain was silence, power was stillness, and survival meant becoming both. The others called the place cursed. They refused to go near it. He returned to it every night. Eventually, the masters noticed again, but this time, they did not whisper. They summoned him and spoke aloud. You are ready. No ceremony, no applause, just new scars and an assignment. From that moment, he was no longer a servant. He was a weapon, and weapons don't ask questions. They only wait for orders. He was 13 when he entered the catacombs alone. No escort, no light. Just the sound of dust falling from bones older than memory. The tomb doors groaned shut behind him, and the heat vanished. Here, in the cold beneath Korriban, time did not move forward. It only sank. He was told not to speak, not to touch, not to run. But he was not afraid. He walked past the corpses of those who had tried to claim greatness, their bodies still armored, their hands still clenched. The statues watched him, eyes carved from obsidian, faces carved from hatred. He saw the mark of a Juntapal, the first Sith Lord, a name whispered like prophecy. But even Paul was dust now, his mask cracked, his tomb stained with sacrifice. Further in, he saw the resting place of Tulak Hord, the greatest swordsman to ever breathe. Hord's blade was gone, taken by thieves or time, but the echo of his rage still hung in the air. Like a scream caught in stone, the boy didn't flinch. He listened and understood something no one had taught him. The dead don't need followers. They need replacements. He placed his hand on the tomb wall and waited. Nothing happened. No visions. No lightning. Only a pulse. Slow, like a heartbeat, like the Force breathing through the dust. He stayed there for hours, breathing with it, listening. Somewhere behind him, a voice said, "Do you feel them?" He didn't turn, didn't speak. The master stood in silence beside him, and together they listened to the dead. They weren't ghosts. They were lessons, written in blood, etched in stone. Legends weren't born. They were buried, and then remembered. That was the Sith truth. Glory didn't come from survival. It came from sacrifice. To be remembered, you had to die in a way that echoed. He studied how they were buried, how their names were preserved, which ones were honored, which ones were forgotten. Some tombs were grand, others broken open, looted, disrespected. He made note of every detail. Because this was his future, he would not be nameless. He would not be forgotten. The acolytes above spoke of power like it was a weapon. He now knew better. Power was memory, and memory could last longer than empires. In the deepest vault, he found a wall that no one had dared open. It was sealed with words in a dialect lost to time. Even the masters avoided it. But he returned to it each day, sitting before it in meditation, waiting for something, anything. He bled before it, starved before it, fell asleep at its base. And one day, it answered, a crack, thin, silent, running from top to bottom, and a whisper, not in basic, not in Sith, but in thought. It said, "Welcome." He never told anyone. He simply smiled for the first time. From that day forward, his steps grew heavier, his presence darker. The other students stopped meeting his gaze, and the masters began referring to him by title. No longer the boy, no longer the still one. They called him apprentice, but he was no one's. Not anymore. Because deep in the dark, the legends had spoken, and he had listened, not as a student, but as one of them. He spoke little, but everything around him began to answer. Doors that once remained sealed opened without code. Weapons no one could lift bent toward his hand. Even the air shifted when he entered a room, not through commands, not through screaming, through stillness. The Force moved with him now, not as a servant, but as a shadow. It listened to his silence and obeyed. He never challenged his masters. He outlasted them. One by one, their power waned. Their tempers frayed. Their students vanished. He watched it all, like a historian documenting extinction. And when one fell, publicly, violently, he did not flinch. He stepped forward and took their place, without permission, without resistance. The others stood back because he didn't ask. He claimed there was no ceremony, no new robes, no words spoken aloud, Only acknowledgement. A shift in the eyes of those who remained. Now they bowed, not deeply, not willingly, but just enough. Enough to survive. He took no apprentices, not yet. He watched them instead, as he had once been watched. He learned what fear truly looked like. Not screaming, not panic, but silence. Unbroken. That's what true power was. Not the ability to destroy, but the patience to wait, to build tension so sharp it could slice without touching. When the Dark Council summoned him, he didn't kneel. He stood, still, motionless. They spoke of order, of obedience, of structure within the empire. He said nothing. They waited for response. He gave none. And somehow, they let him go, because even they weren't sure who had summoned who. He returned to Korriban, not as a student, not as a servant, as something else. He reclaimed the same chambers where he once bled, sealed the doors, carved new markings, symbols of control, not chaos. He began to write journals, instructions, not in basic, not in Sith, but in silence. A language only he understood, one based on breath, on presence, on restraint. And then he chose one student, a girl, barely older than he had been. Elden Axe. She had the same quiet in her eyes, the same fear that hid behind control. He did not comfort her. He did not train her. He broke her, then rebuilt her, again and again. He made her dig her own chamber, made her sleep in the tombs, made her read ancient texts until her eyes bled. And still, she remained. He never praised her, never punished her, only watched, the way his masters once watched him. Power wasn't given. It wasn't taught. It was recognized. And when she began to walk without flinching, he began to speak to her, not of lessons, but of legacy. He told her that the Force is not a flame. It is a current. It does not serve. It drowns, and those who stand in it must be silent, or be swept away. This was the only language he believed in. Stillness, presence, dominance without sound. And the galaxy, though it did not yet know his name, was already beginning to feel it. Not as fear, not yet, but as tension, growing, waiting. He was no longer a shadow, no longer the boy beneath the sand. He was a presence carved into the bedrock of Korriban, and his story was just beginning. He was 11 when the first poison entered his blood, a liquid without color, without scent, hidden in the food he hadn't earned. No warning, no lesson, just the sudden slow paralysis of his hands, the burning inside his teeth, the silence from the others as he fell. He didn't scream, didn't ask for help. He crawled, bent, dragged himself into the tombs, and vanished. 3 days passed. No one looked for him. No one cared. When he returned, his lips were black, his veins visible, his heart slower. But he walked. And when they saw him standing again, the acolytes took a step back, not out of respect, out of confusion, because no one had ever come back from that dose. Not once. He didn't speak about it. He didn't need to. The poison was still there, moving through him, changing him. The Sith called it a trial, but it wasn't a test. It was a message, one he chose to reply to, by not dying. Weeks later, it happened again. Another dose, different formula, stronger. This one caused his vision to split, made him see ghosts inside stone. made him dream while awake. Still, he did not break. He bent, he bled, but he did not fall. One night, he sat in the temple corridor. While the world spun sideways, his skin peeled from his palms. His heart stopped twice, and then restarted, slower, quieter. But it beat. He waited for the next trial. It never came, because they had run out of poisons, and he had run out of fear. He began studying venoms himself, extracting glands from tomb scorpions, draining fluids from half-dead toccata. He poisoned his own blood, drop by drop, built tolerance, not as a warrior, but as a ritual, not to survive, but to understand, because poison reveals truth. Who you are when your breath is thin, when your bones beg to stop, when the galaxy narrows to a single beat, and you decide to keep going. The masters noticed, but they did not intervene. They wanted him to break, but he didn't. He studied alchemy next, not to create life, but to test it. He dissolved stone beetles in acid, treated the remains with dark ichor, and inhaled the vapor. Each experiment brought him closer, not to death, but to something worse, understanding. One day, he walked through the meditation hall, and blood poured from his nose. He left it there, didn't wipe it, didn't stop. They whispered behind him, some with disgust, some with awe. He said nothing, but something inside him shifted. The poisons were no longer enemies. They were part of him. His skin lost its color. His breath became shallow. He began to glow faintly. In the darkness, not with light, but with heat, as if something inside him was burning and would never stop. And still, he was calm. Stillness in his walk, silence in his hands, eyes like glass, dead things behind them. They asked his name. He did not give it. They asked his title. He said it hadn't been spoken yet, because names meant nothing, until they were carved into something permanent, until the galaxy bled from hearing them, until someone whispered it, and the room grew colder. So he waited, and in that waiting, he grew, not in size, not in strength, but in silence, and in poison. Pain came in many forms. Some were sharp, others slow. Some came from others. Most came from within. But all of it taught him something. His first broken bone didn't come from battle. It came from falling down a pit, one the others had set for him. They laughed when they saw him vanish, laughed louder when they walked away. But they never checked the bottom, never waited for the scream, because it never came. He hit stone, felt his leg crack sideways, felt ribs fold beneath weight, felt blood rush up his throat. But no sound escaped. Not then, not ever. He lay there for hours, counting breaths, blinking through dust. Then he moved, bone grinding against bone, flesh tearing on jagged edges. He dragged himself upward, one ledge at a time, clawed through rock, bit through blood, and when he emerged, covered in dirt, shaking, the others looked away, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't understand. They thought he was lucky, but it wasn't luck. It was choice. Pain was not the enemy. It was the instructor, the reminder. He learned to break himself deliberately, to test healing, to test will. Dislocated his shoulder to escape a sealed crawl space. Sliced his own hand to bleed on a Sith lock. Snapped a finger just to dull his own fear. Every injury was a page in a book only he was reading. He studied the way pain changed others. How some begged, how some lashed out, how some collapsed completely. But he never judged them. He simply observed and remembered, because understanding pain meant understanding control. The masters watched him differently now, no longer amused, now cautious. One of them once struck him across the face. No warning, no lesson attached, just a blow. The boy stood still, didn't blink, didn't breathe. And when the master turned to leave, he whispered something, a word no one else heard. The master stopped, just for a moment. And after that, never touched him again, because pain endured, was dangerous. But pain understood, was something worse. He memorized pressure points, nerve clusters, the threshold between obedience and collapse. When sparring, he never went for speed, never chased victory. He waited, let his opponent think they were winning, then applied exactly enough pressure to crack a rib, or dislocate a knee, or shatter a confidence. Pain, to him, was an equation, a map, and he was learning every direction. One night, he found a younger acolyte crying in the corner, face bruised, lip bleeding, shaking from a lesson gone wrong. He didn't comfort them, didn't speak. He just sat beside them and handed them a blade, not to use, to hold, to feel its weight, to remember that pain was only half the lesson. The other half was what you did with it. That acolyte survived, years longer than expected. No one ever knew why, but he remembered, because pain, shared in silence, could become something else, and he was becoming something else. Not just a student, not just a survivor, something darker, something quieter, something carved not in stone, but in scars. And the temple itself seemed to shift around him. Walls colder, shadows longer, eyes that watched him now looked away, not in respect, but in recognition. He wasn't learning pain anymore. He was it, and the others could feel it. In every step he took, they were not accidents. They were not missteps. They were not forgettable. But they were quiet. One by one, they vanished. The bullies, the loud ones, the ones who mocked the stillness, the ones who mistook silence for weakness. Gone. Not all at once, but over time, a pattern too slow to track, too scattered to name. But he knew, because he had watched them, measured them, studied every crack in their posture, every edge in their tone, every flaw they carried, like a hidden fracture waiting to break. He never attacked in public, never struck in the arena, never challenged anyone. Instead, he waited for solitude, for shadow, for the perfect moment when no one would ask questions. One disappeared during a supply run. Another vanished after a midnight meditation. A third never returned from the valley. The masters asked nothing. They had seen it before. Sith training was survival, and the temple always took its price. But some knew, not with proof, but with instinct. They stopped making eye contact, stopped speaking near him, started avoiding shared corridors. The air grew colder when he entered a room, not through force power, but through reputation. And reputation was louder than evidence. He began receiving privileges. No one said aloud. Longer access to restricted texts, freedom to wander deeper holes, unspoken rights granted by unspoken fear. Still, he said nothing, took nothing he didn't earn. But those who survived learned quickly. When someone disappeared, he had already predicted it. One night, a boy tried to kill him in his sleep. Blade sharp, hands shaking. He didn't move, didn't breathe, and the boy stopped, paralyzed, frozen by something unseen. Not force fear, not mind tricks, just the quiet, the suffocating stillness of someone who did not fear death. Because death had already knelt before him, the boy dropped the weapon and ran. He was gone by morning. No body, no trail, only silence. Another time, an acolyte challenged him directly, in the open, surrounded by witnesses. He stepped forward, unarmed, expression calm. The duel lasted 4 seconds. A single grip, a twist, a collapse. The body did not bleed, but it did not rise again. He left it where it fell, and walked away. The masters watched, and said nothing, because this was what they had waited for. Not a soldier, not a brute, but something colder, sharper, more precise. He wasn't just surviving the temple. He was reshaping it, one whisper at a time, one absence at a time. The halls began to echo differently. The doors opened before he touched them. Some claimed the tombs had grown quieter, but that was wrong. They were simply listening now, because even the dead could feel his presence. He wrote nothing, taught no lessons, made no speeches, but still, they followed, not from loyalty, from instinct, the instinct that told them, if they didn't move with him, they would vanish like the rest. He never smiled, never celebrated, because there was nothing to celebrate, only progress. And in that progress, the blood faded, the fear grew, and the disappearances became expected. He wasn't hunting, he was clearing space for something new, something larger, something only silence could prepare. And soon, someone important would notice, someone who would not vanish, but who would demand something greater. A test, a price, a master. And when that day came, he would not hesitate, because everyone else was already gone. The silence had weight now. It wasn't stillness, it was pressure. A warning that something was coming, and it would not ask for permission. The temple halls changed their rhythm. Footsteps slowed around him. Whispers dropped into breath. Eyes found other walls to look at. Because something had shifted, not suddenly, but like a stone pressed deeper into sand. He wasn't trying to be seen, but now he couldn't be unseen. His name wasn't spoken, not out of respect, but out of caution, because when names are tied to disappearances, they stop feeling like names and start sounding like warnings. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He didn't need to speak. They remembered the faces that were gone. They remembered where they used to sit, and how those seats now stayed empty. It was never rage, never spectacle, only stillness, followed by blood. Sometimes a pool, sometimes a smear, sometimes just the smell, but always there, always quiet. He once stood outside the meditation chamber for 6 straight hours, didn't enter, didn't knock, just waited. When the occupant finally emerged, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved, as if the waiting had been worse than anything else. And maybe it had, because that was his true power now. Not combat, not cruelty, anticipation. He made others imagine their own deaths. Before he ever raised a hand, the mind collapses faster. when it believes the end is already decided. He had learned that from poison, and turned it into presence. His movements became deliberate, his meals ritual, his nights spent in absolute silence, not because he needed to, but because it forced the others to fill the silence with fear. One acolyte began to mimic him, walked with the same posture, ate with the same hand still in his lap, spoke less. It didn't last long, because imitation, without understanding, is just noise, and noise gets silenced. They found her lightsaber shattered. No body, only her robe, folded, clean, placed on the training mat she used to kneel on. No one spoke her name again. He didn't smile, didn't feel triumph. He just moved forward, because every act of stillness was another stone in the foundation. He was building beneath them. And now, the foundation had drawn attention. A figure arrived, robed in black and gold. Older, darker, eyes that didn't blink. A Sith Lord, silent, watching, not to test him, but to choose him. The moment came with no warning. A whisper during a lesson. Come. No one else was summoned. No one else looked up, but they all knew. He followed the Lord into the tombs, past the stone doors, past the broken statues, to a chamber where the walls were shaped like blades, where the floor had never seen dust. This was not a classroom, not a trial. This was where legacies began and ended. The Lord turned, studied him. No questions, no compliments. Only this: "You will be mine." And he nodded, not out of submission, but because he had already decided. This was not surrender. It was selection. Stillness, followed by blood, followed by power. And this was the beginning of something larger, something that would not vanish, something that would not be silent, not forever. He never blinked, never slept, never sat. He stood for hours, motionless, watching the students like statues. He might one day break. The masters called him Lord Maltras, but no one spoke it twice. Not even in the dark, not even alone. Because he didn't just hear. He noticed. Every glance, every breath, every tremble. He slept in the archives, sat cross-legged in vaults so cold the walls dripped with condensation. He whispered to holocrons that hadn't activated in centuries. And when one spoke back, he smiled, but it was the kind of smile you only saw before a death. Darth Chratis had been chosen by him, not because of promise, but because of stillness, because out of all the acolytes, he was the only one who didn't react to the stare, didn't flinch, didn't blink, just returned it. And in that moment, Maltras had found what he wanted. Not ambition, not rage, but potential. A flame so quiet, it burned without light. The other students whispered about the things Maltras did, the way he tested loyalty by erasing memory, how he bound students to walls and left them there for days, how he could hear thoughts before they were fully formed. He didn't punish failure. He collected it and locked it away inside the minds of those who could not forget. Chratis watched, listened, endured. He obeyed orders with silence. When told to stand, he stood until he bled. When told to meditate, he sank into trances that lasted full rotations. Maltras pushed him harder than any other. No food, no water, no voice for 7 days. And when asked to speak, Chratis answered in a whisper, "I was listening." Maltras had not expected that. And yet, he nodded, because Chratis wasn't just surviving. He was becoming something else. Maltras trained him in manipulation, not through the force, through silence, how to make others speak by saying nothing, how to command a room without raising a hand, how to strip someone of certainty by changing nothing at all. He taught him the history of forgotten rituals, the lost art of stillness as dominance. And Chratis learned quickly, too quickly, because Maltras did not teach out of care. He taught to be obeyed, to be feared, to never be replaced. But replacement was already forming. In the quiet, in the dark, the others noticed that Maltras stood closer to Chratis now, spoke slower, paused longer, because something had shifted. And masters, even the cruel ones, can feel when the end begins. But they ignore it. They always do. And Chratis never gave him reason to fear, never spoke back, never disobeyed, never questioned a command. He simply absorbed the lessons, the violence, the rituals, until one day he no longer needed to be taught, because he had already seen what power looked like when it refused to sleep, and he was ready to dream without fear, to end the lesson the only way Sith do, by taking the silence and making it permanent. They weren't just tools, they weren't just records. Holocrons breathed, not with air, with memory. Some whispered, some screamed, some refused to open. But Chratis made them speak. Maltras kept dozens, stacked like bones across his private vault, guarded by scripts too ancient to translate, etched in Sith runes that shimmered when no light touched them, each one locked with pain, or silence, or fear. He taught Chratis how to unlock them, not with code, not with touch, but with emotion. How much of yourself are you willing to burn? He once asked, to know something you can never forget. Chratis didn't answer. He reached forward and bled into the holocron. It opened. The gatekeeper inside did not speak at first. It stared, studied, as if deciding whether this apprentice was worthy of memory. It showed him visions of the great hyperspace war, of Marka Ragnos dying without sound, of Naga Sado burning fleets. From inside meditation spheres, he saw Sith who fed on fear, Jedi who turned, because silence felt more honest than the code. He watched entire bloodlines extinguish themselves to protect one secret, and when it ended, he collapsed, hands shaking, mouth dry, but his mind was quiet, clearer, because pain had purpose, and knowledge was never free. Maltras watched from the shadows and said nothing. The next day, he opened another. This one screamed, not from hatred, from grief. The voice inside belonged to a Sith who had loved once and regretted it forever. The lesson was simple. Power is not destroyed by love, but love is always consumed by power. Chratis didn't weep, but something inside him shifted. The deeper he went, the older the memories became. He saw the original Dark Jedi, who had fled the Republic, who built tombs, not to rest in, but to teach from. He saw the first time a student betrayed their master and was praised for it. He watched rituals no longer practiced, chants forgotten even by the council. He copied them, memorized them, spoke them in the dark, when no one could hear, because the holocrons were not just teachers. They were mirrors, and the longer he looked, the more he saw himself. Maltras grew distant, still present, but colder. He stopped correcting, stopped testing, stopped watching with interest, because now he was watching with suspicion. One evening, Chratis found a holocron that wasn't in the vault. It was hidden beneath Maltras's sleeping mat, dustless, untouched, locked by the Force itself. Chratis didn't try to open it. Not yet. He studied it, night after night, until it opened, on its own. Inside was no gatekeeper, only a voice, Maltras's voice, younger, broken, confessing things no Sith should ever say aloud. He spoke of fear, of visions he could not stop, of waking nightmares that followed him into the tombs. He begged the Force to silence his mind, even for one night. It never did, and Chratis understood. The Master had never slept, not out of strength, but out of terror, because sleep meant dreaming, and dreaming meant remembering. Maltras wasn't watching them. He was hiding from himself. Chratis closed the holocron, placed it back, and waited, because now the end would not be out of ambition. It would be a mercy. There were no lectures, no holo projectors, no datapads, only wounds. Every lesson left a mark, some inside the mind, most beneath the skin. Maltras believed pain was the truest teacher, not the pain of failure, but the pain of survival. He made Chratis fight with weighted blades, on shifting stone, blindfolded. One mistake, and the edge found skin, left trails across his chest, his back, his arms. He never flinched, never asked to stop, because each cut taught him something, not just how to defend, but how to think. He learned where his enemy would stand. By listening to the dust, he learned to predict movement. By feeling wind before sound, he learned that pain could make time slow down, could give him seconds. Others wasted screaming. Maltras watched him bleed, but never interfered, because blood was progress. One day, he was instructed to carve a name into the stone walls of the sanctum. Not with a tool, with his finger. The stone was ancient, coarse, unforgiving, but he obeyed, pressed his hand against it, let the skin peel, let the bones scrape, and wrote the name slowly, carefully, without a sound. When it was done, the blood dripped in silence. Maltras looked once, then walked away. No praise, no nod. But the message was clear. You earn your legacy. In pieces. He was taught the points of the body, where pressure could stop a heart, where a single nerve could end movement forever. He was made to practice. On prisoners, some begged, some cursed, some wept. He didn't respond, because it wasn't cruelty. It was precision. If he hesitated, he failed, and failure meant the lesson restarted. From the beginning, he began marking his own body. Small lines, not for memory, for control. Each scar was a message, a reminder of what he had survived, of what he now understood. Maltras once asked him, "What is strength?" Chratis didn't answer. He pointed to the longest scar, running across his ribs, then walked away, because words had never taught him anything. One night, Maltrus returned from the tombs, bleeding from the eye. He didn't explain, didn't allow healing. He simply sat and stared at the fire. For hours, Chratis didn't ask. He only studied the pattern of the blood as it ran down his master's face, because even that was a lesson. The following week, he was ordered to fast. No food, no water, no sleep. 7 days. On the 8th, he stood in the circle, thin, pale, eyes like glass. Maltrus struck him hard. Again and again, Chratis did not move, did not fall. And when the strike stopped, he whispered, "I am still here." Maltrus stared, and for the first time, he looked afraid, not because Chratis had endured, but because he hadn't even reacted. The lessons were supposed to shape him, break him, rebuild him. But Chratis was no longer bending. He was observing, calculating, and waiting. Each wound became a countdown, each test a measure. And Maltrus, for all his strength, had started repeating himself. Because there are only so many scars one can give before they become reflections. And Chratis was no longer a student. He was becoming what the pain had built. There is a moment when the student stops watching the master's hands and starts watching his breathing. That moment had come. Maltrus was not weak, not old, not decayed by the force. He was precise, paranoid, prepared for betrayal. But even the cautious forget to fear the quiet ones. Chratis did not rush, did not plan a spectacular end, did not stalk his master through the corridors like the others imagined. He simply watched. He noticed how Maltrus touched his temple whenever visions returned, how he exhaled slowly before opening a holocron, how his right hand shook only when closing one, how he never slept. Not once. Chratis understood the truth. Maltrus feared dreams more than death, because dreams remembered what waking could hide. So Chratis waited for night, not because Maltrus slept then, but because everyone else did. Silence makes killing simple, but precision makes it invisible. He found his master in the vault, sitting before a cluster of ancient holocrons, their red light pulsing like beating hearts. Maltrus knew he was there. He didn't turn, didn't reach for a weapon. He only whispered, "I saw this coming." Chratis stepped closer, slow, unhurried. Maltrus exhaled, a long, trembling breath. "You have learned everything," he said, "except mercy." Chratis shook his head. It was not true. This was mercy. Maltrus's voice cracked. "You think I deserve peace?" Chratis didn't answer. He placed a hand on the back of his master's neck. Maltrus didn't resist, didn't summon lightning, didn't reach for his blade. He simply closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, the force tightened around Chratis's fingers, not to kill, to cradle, a precise application of disruption and release, a technique learned not from holocrons, but from watching people slip into unconsciousness. After pain, Maltrus's breathing slowed, his heartbeat softened, his body collapsed. Without injury, without blood, without a scar, Chratis lowered him gently to the cold floor, not like a victor, like a pallbearer. Maltrus's final whisper was not hate, not regret. It was relief. "Thank you." And then, silence. A silence different from death. one that filled the vault. With absence, the holocrons dimmed, as if honoring something. Only they understood. Chratis stood there for a long time, breathing, listening. He did not loot the vault, did not take trophies. He closed each holocron with both hands, one by one. Then he walked out, leaving the body for the temple to find. There was no alarm, no panic, no uproar, only whispers. Maltrus is dead. Maltrus is gone. Maltrus is free. No one said Chratis did it. No one accused him. They didn't need to, because power does not need credit. It needs recognition. The Dark Council was informed. One less lord, one vacancy. But the council didn't summon Chratis. Not yet. They knew the cycle. The temple would sort itself. The strongest would rise, and strength had already chosen. When Chratis returned to the vault, Maltrus's body was gone, not stolen, claimed by the temple, by the tombs, by the force. He traced the spot where the body had lain, then turned away. His apprenticeship had not ended with ceremony. It ended with stillness, and stillness is how legends begin. He walked through the halls, unafraid. Doors opened. Students stepped aside. Masters lowered their eyes, not in submission, in acknowledgement, because they understood what had happened. Not that Maltrus had been killed, but that Chratis had chosen how he died. And choice is the purest form of power. From that night on, he no longer followed. He did not wait for permission, for instruction, for approval. He moved, like someone who had already seen the ending, and decided to rewrite it. He stepped onto Korriban like it had been waiting for him, not with open arms, but with silence. No wind, no greeting, only the sound of his boots sinking into red dust. The other lords did not speak. The acolytes did not cheer, because power didn't need announcement. It was felt. And when Chratis returned, they felt it, not in his stride, but in the way the temple grew colder, in the way the tomb doors seemed heavier. He wasn't here to reclaim anything. He had never truly left, only risen, now a lord, crowned not with ceremony, but with survival. The same halls that once ignored him now made space when he passed. Statues that once loomed now seemed to bow. But Chratis didn't linger, didn't gloat, didn't mark his arrival with thunder. He walked past the monuments, past the screaming walls, past the sites of all his former tests. He moved deeper, beyond the central archives, beyond the main catacombs, to a place older than memory, a rift in the rock, long sealed by dust and fear. He opened it with a single gesture, no words, no shunt, just intention, and the stone obeyed. The path led downward, through roots twisted in stone, through corridors that hadn't seen breath in centuries. This was not where students trained. This was where Sith were buried, before the valley had a name. It was not sacred, it was forgotten, and that's why he chose it, because no one fears what they remember, only what they've tried to forget. The air thickened as he descended, not with heat, with memory. You could feel the history pressing against your chest. Old screams turned into echo, old rituals turned into scent. He stepped into a wide chamber, cut from black stone, its floor marked with concentric circles, its walls layered with dust that refused to fall. And at the center, Nothing. No throne. No altar. No monument. Just silence. This would be his sanctum. Not because of its depth, not because of its secrecy, but because it didn't want him there. And that meant it was perfect. He placed a single stone at the center of the room, not carved, not marked, just a weight. Then he knelt and waited. He stayed there for hours, then days, listening, feeling, and the Force answered. Not with visions, not with voices, with pressure, the kind that builds before something breaks. When he opened his eyes, the chamber was darker, not from light, from presence. He began to etch runes into the walls, not copied, created, not Sith, not Jedi, something older, symbols that didn't translate, only resonated. They pulsed when touched, flickered when ignored, and slowly the chamber began to breathe, not with air, with tension, a living place, built from refusal. And when it was complete, he sealed the entrance, with no lock, no barrier, only fear, because the only ones who would come here were those who didn't need to be told to turn back. Chratis had returned to Korriban, not as a student, not as an apprentice, but as the weight that would press down on everything above. It was not called a throne room. It had no throne. It was not called a temple. There were no idols. It was simply a sanctum, buried deep beneath every lie the Sith told themselves. And it was his, not by claim, by presence. There were no guards, no lights, no signs, just pressure, so thick it slowed breath. The deeper one stepped, the less sound followed, because the Force, down here, did not echo. It waited. The walls pulsed, like veins beneath skin, and in the center of it all, Chratis sat, cross-legged, still, facing a circle of stone he had carved with his own hands. No student knew how. No one had seen it built. But it was real, a space that bent the Force inward, folded it like cloth, pressed it against itself, until it vibrated. He called it the core, not because it powered anything, but because it stripped everything else away. Titles, names, ambition, all of it faded here, leaving only what could not be spoken. Power, not as a weapon, but as identity. He didn't summon students. They came on their own, drawn by rumor, by whispers, by a presence they could not explain. They entered as acolytes, but left different, not because he taught them, because he unmade them. They came seeking strength. He offered them silence. They came hungry for titles. He fed them stillness. Some wept, some screamed. Most left before the first hour passed. But a few stayed, not because they understood, because they wanted to. He did not speak to them at first. He let the sanctum speak, the pressure, the darkness, the air. It bent people, cracked them, filtered them, until only the core remained. Then he spoke. One sentence, only once. What are you without your name? Most couldn't answer. Some tried. Others begged to leave. But the ones who stayed broke, not into pieces, into clarity. They returned to the surface, quieter, darker, unshaken. And the other masters began to notice. Their pupils no longer hesitated, no longer flinched, no longer feared. They obeyed, but not from loyalty, from understanding. Chratis did not create soldiers. He created reflections, versions of himself, split across younger faces, but not copies, not slaves, just echoes, learning how to become storms. The council was aware, but they said nothing, because fear is not always loud. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it waits. And they waited to see what would emerge from that sanctum. Next, he kept no records, left no teachings behind. If you didn't survive the chamber, you didn't deserve the knowledge. One girl meditated inside the core. For 3 days, no food, no sound. When she left, her eyes didn't blink. She didn't speak for a month. And when she did, it was in a language that made lights flicker. He called her back, only once. And when she knelt, he placed a hand on her head. No words, no force surge, just silence. And when she stood, she wasn't a student anymore. She was something else. Not a Sith Lord. Not yet. But something worse. A believer. And belief, when shaped in silence, becomes prophecy. He didn't call them sermons. He didn't call them anything. He just spoke. No platform. No elevation. No crowd. Only a dimly lit chamber. Students seated on cold stone. Eyes lowered. Breath held. He spoke rarely. But when he did, the silence around his words felt louder than sound. His voice was slow, measured, cold, not with hate, with precision, because words were tools, and tools could wound. He taught them how to breathe, not for calm, for control. He told them, the force isn't fire, it's pressure. If you push too hard, it shatters. If you hesitate, it slips. You must become the exact weight required to bend the world, no more, no less. He didn't lecture. He remembered, described how Moltres taught through torment, how pain could shape focus. But he warned them, pain without purpose was noise. He taught them how to stand until their bones begged to kneel. How to listen, until sound disappeared. He asked them questions they couldn't answer. What are you beneath your training? Who taught you to want? What will you become when no one tells you who to be? The students broke in different ways. Some cried, some raged, some walked into the tombs and never returned. He didn't stop them, didn't punish. Because breaking was part of the refinement, and those who stayed were sharper. They spoke slower, moved with less sound. They learned that stillness could disarm a blade before it was drawn. They learned that fear wasn't something to defeat, but to carry, like a weapon no one else could see. And they learned that power wasn't what others saw in you. It was what remained. When everything else had been taken, he told them the story of a boy who once crawled through a pit with a broken leg and blood in his teeth. He never said it was him. He didn't have to, because truth doesn't need a name to be recognized. He gave no ranks, no promotions. If you wanted a title, you hadn't listened. If you needed validation, you hadn't learned. He dismissed one student with just a glance, no violence, no command. And the student left the temple without a word. No one asked why, because they all felt it. When he looked at you, you either stood taller or shattered. There was no middle. The Sith Order had always been built on ambition, climbing over corpses, clawing for status. But Chratis offered something worse, a reason to obey. That wasn't fear, a belief that stillness itself could crush empires. And belief was harder to kill than bloodlines. He once ended a duel. Before it began, the challenger raised a saber. Chratis didn't move. The blade lowered. The acolyte dropped to his knees, not because of the force, but because he realized he had already lost. The moment he wanted to win, Chratis didn't smile, didn't praise. He simply turned and walked away. Because power wasn't what you proved. It was what others couldn't deny. They didn't fail all at once. They broke in pieces, not with screams, but with quiet, not with rebellion, but with surrender. Some forgot how to speak, some forgot how to fight, some forgot what they had wanted. Before entering the chamber, he didn't strike them, didn't scold, didn't lift a hand. They broke because they saw themselves and didn't recognize what was left. One student, Aris, strong in the force, quick with a blade, respected by many, disappeared for 7 days. When she returned, she placed her lightsaber at Chratis's feet and walked into the tombs. Alone, she never came back. No one asked where she went. No one needed to, because her footsteps still echoed through the lower halls. Another, Talak, arrogant, loud, hungry for a title, challenged Chratis. In the sanctum, no witnesses, no crowd, just the pressure and the question. Talak screamed. Chratis stayed silent, and when it ended, Talak was still alive, but never spoke again. His eyes would not focus. His hands never stopped shaking. He wandered the temple, like a ghost, still tied to its body. Chratis didn't exile him. He didn't need to, because the Force had already done it for him. The rest learned, through observation. They watched their peers break without being touched, and it frightened them more than death ever could, because dying was simple, but unraveling was slow, painful, irreversible. Chratis began to speak less, not out of distance, out of purpose, because the less he spoke, the more they listened. Every glance became a judgment, every silence a sentence, and still they returned to him, because even in their breaking, they knew this was what made Sith. Not lightning, not severe drills, not conquest, but silence, endured and reshaped. He watched one student meditate until her hair turned white, watched another forget their own name and answer only to the Force, watched 2 rivals swear never to speak again, unless they could speak in unison. None of it was ordered, none of it was praised. It was transformation, and it was enough. The other lords called it madness, called Chratis dangerous, but they didn't intervene, because even they felt the weight of what he was building. Not an army, not a cult, a truth hidden beneath the surface, woven into silence. A lesson so powerful, it needed no title, no legacy, only presence. And presence could not be unlearned. They broke because he didn't stop them, because he knew some things must be shattered before they become unbreakable. And those who survived, truly survived, left the sanctum without fear, because they had already lost everything. that could be taken. And what remained was not a student, not even a Sith, but a vessel, carrying forward the shape of something ancient, something quiet, something inevitable. And Chratis watched them go, one by one, knowing they would never be whole again, only sharper, darker, quieter, and that was enough. She was not the strongest, not the fastest, not the loudest, but she stayed when others shattered. She stayed when others begged to leave. She stayed when silence crushed lungs and stillness unmade names. She remained. Her name was Elden Axe, and she was not chosen. She was noticed. Chratis saw her in the corner of the chamber, knees tucked, breath shallow, eyes locked forward, not in fear, not in awe, in calculation. She was not trying to survive. She was measuring something, and Chratis paused. Just once, because for the first time in years, he saw someone watching him, the way he once watched Maltris, not for weakness, not for imitation, for pattern, for weight, for flaw. He said nothing. Let her stay. Let her attend his sermons. Let her kneel longer than the others. Let her sit closest to the core, not as reward, as warning, because proximity to power doesn't protect you, it exposes you. And she understood that. When students whispered about her, she ignored them. When one tried to challenge her, she didn't rise, didn't strike, didn't move. He collapsed anyway, not from injury, from something heavier. Chratis saw it happen and said nothing, because sometimes the Force doesn't need to be used. It needs to be witnessed. Axe didn't speak often, but when she did, her words cut clean. She questioned teachings others were too afraid to touch, asked why the code was never discussed, why the strongest always died screaming, why Chratis never named a successor. He answered, none of it. Because answers are not what shape Sith, but her presence began to shape the sanctum. Students stepped aside before she entered a room, not out of respect, out of uncertainty, because power can be explained, but potential cannot. She began fasting without command, stayed awake for rotations, trained alone, blindfolded, bleeding, silent, and Chratis watched, not with pride, not with approval, with attention, because something was growing in the silence between them, not trust, not loyalty, something more dangerous, recognition. When she meditated, he stood behind her. When she sparred, he listened to her breath. When she entered the sanctum, the runes pulsed. She asked no favors, made no demands, and yet he gave her more time than any student before her. She began receiving texts meant for lords. She began deciphering rituals Chratis had never explained. She began completing sentences he never started. And still, he said nothing. Because a storm doesn't warn the wind, it listens for the one who breathes with it. She was becoming something he had not intended. Not a mirror, not a tool, but a shadow. One that didn't follow, but walked beside him. And that was new, because Chratis had built his power on stillness, on fear. But Axe wasn't afraid. She didn't want to rule him. She wanted to surpass him. And he let her, for now, because somewhere in the dark, he began to wonder, was this what legacy looked like? Or was this how death begins. She never raised her voice, never interrupted, never boasted. But when she moved, others moved slower. When she sat, others stood, not because she commanded them, because they didn't know what she would do. And that was enough. Elder Nax wasn't a prodigy. She was a fracture, something broken, that cut deeper than it should. She asked questions no one had dared, not because she was defiant, because she was curious, in the way that made others uncomfortable. Why don't we use titles? What does fear accomplish when it's expected? Are we Sith, or are we waiting to be? Chratis never punished her. He let the room answer. Silence, pressure, stillness. She didn't back down. She absorbed it, let it fold into her, let it sharpen her edges. They said she walked like she was made of glass, thin, clear, fragile. But no one touched her twice, because the first time always cut. She once knelt for 14 hours, without shifting. Her blood dried across her lips, her legs trembled, her eyes never closed. Chratis passed her 3 times, said nothing, offered nothing. On the 15th hour, she collapsed, not from weakness, from exhaustion. When she woke, she didn't ask how long she'd been gone. She asked when she could kneel again. Chratis allowed it, not because she'd earned it, because she'd demanded nothing. And those who demand nothing are harder to control. She trained in darkness, chose the coldest chamber, fasted through moons, slept in silence. But it wasn't discipline. It was clarity. Pain didn't scare her. Failure didn't distract her. Only doubt made her flinch. And Chratis saw it, not in her strength, not in her posture, in her restraint. She didn't chase power. She studied it, watched it, waited for it to make a mistake. That's what made her dangerous. Not what she wanted, but what she could wait for. One student accused her of arrogance, called her hollow, empty, unworthy. She didn't reply, didn't stand, didn't flinch. He struck her, open palm, full force. She bled, but didn't move, just turned her head slowly, and whispered, "Now you're part of me." The boy screamed that night, alone. No one helped him. No one could explain why. Because there are weapons that enter through silence. And Axe had learned how to become one. Chratis spoke with her once. In private, he asked her what she feared. She said, "Becoming what you are." He asked what she meant. She said, "Quiet and full of ghosts." He said nothing, because in that moment, he saw himself reflected in glass, too sharp to touch. And he wondered, had he created her, or had she always been waiting to be seen? Students started calling her the shadow, not because she hid, but because she followed no light. She didn't seek titles. She was given them. She didn't take command. It was offered by those who feared being left behind. And Chratis watched it all, calm, still. But behind his silence, the questions grew. Was this what legacy looked like? Or was this the beginning of his undoing? Because power could be held, but reflections could not. And she was becoming too clear to ignore. He didn't train her. He tested her. He didn't instruct. He withheld, not to punish, to sharpen. Because fire doesn't shape steel. It reveals what steel cannot survive. He placed her in silence and left her there. Days without voice, without orders, Without purpose, most would collapse. She adapted, meditated in pitch black, trained without direction, bled without complaint. He flooded her chamber with heat, watched as her skin blistered, watched as her breathing slowed. She survived it, but not because she endured, because she learned. Doubt wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. She began asking things aloud that even Chratis wouldn't answer. Why did you kill your master? Did he deserve it? Do you fear someone will do the same to you? He listened. Let the questions hang in the air. He didn't give her truth. He gave her weight, because answers carry less power than the space they leave behind. He sent her into the lower tombs, without light, told her there was a scroll, told her nothing else. She was gone for 6 days. When she returned, she didn't speak. She didn't eat. She placed a broken saber hilt at his feet. Not the scroll, just the weapon. He asked nothing. She said only, I had to become something else. He accepted it, because that's what forging was. Not molding, burning. She was not obedient. She was intentional. Not a student, not yet a threat, but something in between, that neither obeyed nor resisted. She disassembled her own saber, left it in pieces, said it made her too loud. She fought with her hands, with pressure, with absence. She moved through corridors, without sound, felt like a shadow that remembered being human. And Chratis began to see what he had built. Not a warrior, not a weapon, a successor, but not his, hers. She began asking others questions, not to test them, to understand them. Why are you here? What will you do when he's gone? Who are you without him? They began to fear her more than him, because she didn't punish, didn't command. She reflected, and no one liked what they saw. One night, she returned from the tombs, covered in ash, her robes burned, hair singed. He asked nothing. She said only, I destroyed what I was. He nodded, because forging is not about fire, it's about what survives after. And she had survived. Everything he didn't say, everything he didn't give. She built herself from absence, and that was stronger than any lesson. But with each step forward, he began to feel it. Not pride, not certainty, but unease. Because the force around her no longer bent, it waited, like it did for him, before the end began. And now, he wondered, was he teaching her, or preparing her? And if so, for what? He once said she was his legacy, but legacies don't watch you like that. She stood still when others bowed. She blinked less than he did. And one day, he realized he hadn't felt her approach. She had learned it. That perfect stillness, the kind that hides in plain sight. He was proud. He told himself that. But pride doesn't sit this quietly. He began watching her the way his own master once watched him, carefully, quietly, with calculation hiding behind approval. She didn't speak unless it mattered, didn't challenge him directly, but her eyes said enough. They held the same question that once ended a life. Why do you still breathe? He taught her too well. Or perhaps she was never learning, just remembering. The sanctum's halls grew colder, not from temperature, from presence. She filled the room, without moving. He called for her one night, said nothing when she arrived, just looked at her, watched the way her hands rested, how her breathing slowed to match his. It was silent, like the moment before a blade drops. He dismissed her, but she didn't turn to leave. She waited. He asked why. She said, "Because one day you'll be gone, and I want to remember the last time you were unsure." Then she left. That night, he didn't sleep. He listened to the stone breathe, to the wind shift beyond the tombs, and he wondered what she had meant. She no longer needed him, but she hadn't replaced him. Not yet. She didn't seek his throne. She waited for it to become empty. That was worse, because it meant she didn't see him as an obstacle. She saw him as time, passing, and one day, time would end. He tested her again, sent her to Dromund Kaas, alone, a mission beneath the citadel, no backup, no guidance. She completed it, without damage, without hesitation, but she didn't report her success. She walked straight past him, as if it no longer mattered, as if he no longer mattered. That was when the fear began. Not loud, not sudden, just a feeling that whatever came next, he wouldn't be part of it. Because power fades, even when it refuses to admit it. And sometimes, your legacy becomes your end. He once carved fear into others. Now it whispered back, and in her stillness, he saw the shape of his own future. Not death, not betrayal, irrelevance. One night, he stood alone in the sanctum, lit a single flame, watched it flicker. He saw her shadow on the wall, but she wasn't there. He turned anyway. Nothing, just emptiness. But the fear remained, because now, he knew, she didn't need to kill him. He was already being erased, not by violence, but by replacement. Quiet, inevitable, just as he had done to the master who came before. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't ambition. It was the nature of Sith. And in her presence, he understood the final lesson. The ones who fear nothing always create something that knows how to wait. And Elden Axe was done waiting. He moved without ceremony, not away from Korriban, not toward anything, just away. The temple did not resist. The tombs did not stir. The air did not grow colder, because it wasn't a departure. It was an extension. The war outside had many names: rebellion, empire, restoration. Maps shifted, fleets screamed. Names were etched in fire across battlefields. Chratis didn't watch them. He listened, because war was never about noise. It was about pressure, and pressure always built where no one looked. He walked beneath cities, through tunnels that had no names, found records etched into walls the council had tried to erase. Not with fire, with time, but time does not forget Sith. He stood in the shadow of the citadel on Dromund Kaas. Not inside, not beneath, around it, like a second skin, forming under its bones. He did not announce his presence. He didn't need to. Those who mattered already felt it. He met no delegations. He bowed to no superiors. He passed lords in dark corridors who did not speak his name. Not out of fear, out of confusion. Because his robes were simple, his voice rarely used, his movements too calm. And yet the walls felt different when he passed. The Empire fought loudly. Chratis fought alone. He entered records rooms no one remembered building, broke into vaults with codes lost during the Cold War, walked past droids that never raised weapons, not because he was authorized, because the Force bent differently around him. He wasn't invisible. He was inevitable. Even the Dark Council only spoke of him in quiet tones, not as a threat, as a presence, the kind that lingered in rooms after the lights went out. He wasn't after power, not the kind they understood. He was after memory. He recovered Sith holocrons buried during the Great Galactic War, found red crystals stained with blood from lords whose names had been sealed behind executions. He listened to voices that screamed in languages no longer spoken, and sometimes he answered them, not with words, with presence. There were whispers of a vault deep beneath Car City, one even the Emperor had sealed, buried beneath failures. A place where betrayals had been hidden, not punished. Chratis found it. He didn't break the seal. He waited. For 3 days, the force shifted first, then the air, then the lock. When the door opened, there was no trap, only silence thick enough to press against the lungs. He stepped inside and smiled, because silence like that only existed in places where pain had been permanent. He found masks without names, lightsabers with no hilts, journals written in codes that broke the reader's mind, and memories that weren't his. He let them in anyway, because to understand the Sith was to inherit their echoes, and he was becoming an echo no one could silence. He didn't report his findings, didn't claim credit, didn't change anything that could be traced. But slowly, very slowly, Dromund Kaas began to shift. One lord vanished after questioning old doctrines. Another stepped down without cause. A third began weeping in meditation and never spoke again. And no one linked it to Chratis, because that was the point. He wasn't attacking. He was erasing. Not records, not people, stability. He was the pressure between empires, and the galaxy, though it burned with fire and fleets, had started to grow quiet. There were places the Dark Council refused to map, not because they were secret, because they were shameful. Ruins beneath Boserda, catacombs under Ziost, outposts left to rot after failed rituals. Chratis didn't search for them. He remembered them. Because the Sith don't forget failure, they bury it, and burial is just permission for something older to wake. He traveled without escort, without record, disappeared for weeks at a time, returned with nothing visible. But those close to him felt the change. His presence thickened, his voice slowed, his breath carried the weight of places that were never meant to echo again. On Malachor 5, he walked the fracture fields alone, where the mass shadow generator had scarred the land beyond healing, where Jedi and Mandalorian bones lay fused in obsidian. He didn't study them. He meditated among them, because echoes were stronger in places where too many died without reason. He found a shard of something deeper than crystal, not alive, not sentient, but aware. He placed it against his chest and bled. No scream, no reaction, just a pause. Then breath, as if something inside him had changed temperature. When he returned to Kars, the wind outside his chambers shifted direction, and no one could explain why. The council knew something had moved, not through reports, through instinct. Because their visions grew quieter, their sleep grew colder, and the Force stopped warning them. He didn't claim a seat, he claimed a silence. And in the council, silence was the most dangerous kind of power. He read transcripts from forgotten interrogations, found names scratched out in margins, Sith lords who vanished without death. He followed those names, not to find them, to understand why they were erased. One had tried to rewrite the code, another had broken the ritual of succession, a third had loved someone they refused to kill. each one punished, not for treason, for deviation. He meditated in their ruins, and did not judge, because history doesn't lie, but the ones who survive it do, and the Sith had survived too much. On Tund, he unearthed a cache of sorcerer scrolls sealed in lead. He didn't open them. He listened to the casing, and it whispered back, not in words, in hunger. He left them untouched, because some knowledge is not meant to be read, only remembered. In the archives below Cast City, he found a corridor labeled for cleaning. Inside, a vault with no key. A vault built before the Emperor's first voice. He didn't force it open. He placed a hand on the door and waited for hours. When it opened, the air inside was dry, as if it had never known time. Inside, a figure knelt in carbonite, still alive, still aware, still screaming in the Force. Chratis did not ask who it was. He only knelt, not in reverence, in respect, because whoever they were, they had seen something the Council had chosen to forget. He touched the carbonite and felt madness. Not wild, focused, the kind that sees too far and cannot look away. He sealed the vault and never returned, because some truths are not meant to be freed, only preserved. He wasn't building an army. He wasn't seeking immortality. He was collecting weight, and every secret the Council buried, he carried, not in datapads, in breath, because power written down can be burned, but power remembered becomes myth. And Darth Chratis was no longer a man. He was becoming memory. He never left warnings, only gaps. A minister disappeared from the Ministry of Intelligence. No screams, no alarms, just a vacant desk and a chair still warm. The report said reassignment, but the agents in black coats started avoiding the lower floors, because names don't vanish without sound unless someone silences them first. And Chratis didn't need to speak. He only needed to watch. He walked corridors that had no lights, places where voices thinned, where footsteps slowed without meaning to. Assassins sent to follow him lost track. Not because he moved fast, because he moved like nothing. He turned war into a shape the Sith had forgotten precision. No invasions, no banners, just a shift in breath. And then someone didn't wake up. He visited the strongholds of minor lords, those who collected students like trophies, those who mistook fear for control. He never challenged them. He only asked questions, and the strongest answers were always silence. One lord began dreaming of his own death, woke screaming for weeks, burned his own archives out of fear that Chratis had already read them. Another found her voice missing, not physically, just absent. Her commands stopped working, her students stopped listening, her power unraveled, not from battle, but from presence. No one linked it to him, because influence doesn't wear a mark. It drips, until everything beneath it sinks. He once stood behind a Sith senator during a public address, said nothing, made no gesture. The senator paused mid-sentence, stumbled, and never returned to the floor again. Some said it was fear, others said it was guilt. But those who truly understood power didn't ask. Because Chratis didn't command respect, he removed it from others. And when they were empty, he left them standing, to watch themselves collapse. He wasn't hated. Hate is loud. He was doubted, and doubt spreads faster than truth. There were rumors of a conclave, lords gathering in secret, hoping to understand his rise, to define him, to decide how to stop him. Chratis attended, He sat last, spoke last, moved least. They questioned his methods, his motives, his silence. He didn't answer. He only recited the names of 4 Sith lords. Out loud. No context. No threat. Just names. One had died in exile. One had fled. One had vanished during a training mission. No one remembered at all. And that was the point. Because the moment no one remembers you, you're already gone. The room fell quiet, and Chratis stood. No weapons, no force surge, just stillness, and left. The conclave never met again. Not because of fear, because of clarity. He wasn't claiming power. He was dissolving it. He returned to Dromund Kaas. Not to rule, to continue. He walked the Nexus corridors, sat in archives where the lights never turned on, studied footnotes in erased texts, learned how the Sith used to speak before fear became theater. He didn't share it. He let it shape him. Because memory, when carried long enough, stops being history. It becomes law. He didn't name students, but some began to act differently. They stood longer in silence. They stopped calling attention to power. They waited before drawing sabers. Not out of discipline, out of reflection, because fear no longer motivated them. Presence did. And that was the mark he left. Not on their faces, but in their choices. Whispers began to follow him. Not rumors, reminders that somewhere in the shadows, a Sith still walked, whose war had no map, and whose weapon was absence. He never held territory, never commanded fleets, never claimed dominion over planets. But across the Empire, Sith lords began to alter their steps when walking past reflections, because something had changed. Not outside, inside. They spoke in smaller rooms, trained with fewer students, replaced shouts with whispers. Not because they were ordered to, because the silence Chratis carried was catching up to them. A war had begun, but it didn't stain maps. It stained memory. He sat across from officers in the intelligence ministry, never gave commands, only listened. And when they spoke too quickly, he left. The ones who hesitated, he returned to. Sometimes with a datapad they thought deleted. Sometimes with a name they'd tried to hide. And sometimes just a look. Because the right silence can make someone rewrite their own report. Not to deceive, to survive. He walked among initiates being tested for dark side potential. Stood in the back of sparring arenas. Never interfered. But when one boy cried after losing, Chratis simply watched. The next morning, the boy was gone. No blood, no report, just gone. And the arena felt colder. He didn't kill to inspire fear. He inspired choices that avoided confrontation entirely. Because real power isn't when others bow. It's when they choose not to stand near you at all. He once walked through the Kaas Citadel Gardens, a place of illusion, curated for appearances. When he left, the gardeners refused to return. Said the soil had soured. Said the air hummed differently. No one believed them. But no one entered again. He met with a Jedi once. Not as enemies. Not as friends. Just as silence meeting silence. On the cliffs of Tython, they stood at opposite edges of a forgotten bridge. Wind between them. Decades of war behind them. The Jedi asked why he had come. Chratis said nothing. The Jedi stepped back. Because sometimes the worst answer is none. Because a Sith who doesn't argue is already winning something deeper. He did not kill the Jedi. He didn't need to. Because the Jedi returned to the temple and began asking questions no one wanted to answer. Chratis's presence was like that, not a shadow, a suggestion that what you believed might not survive reflection. He broke nothing, but things still broke all around him. Ambitions collapsed under their own weight. Alliances frayed before betrayal, and Sith began to vanish from history, not with screams, but with gaps. And gaps are harder to repair than wounds. Elden Axe watched it all, and said nothing, because she had seen the war up close and knew it couldn't be stopped, not with armies, not with rituals, because this was not a war between people. It was a war between ways of being. Loud Sith, quiet Sith, those who conquered, those who erased, and Chratis had already won. Because silence spreads, like mold in stone, like cracks in glass, slow, until the whole structure forgets what held it together. He walked through the tombs beneath Korriban once more. No ceremony, no purpose, just memory. The stones did not respond. They didn't need to. He had become one of them. No monument, no throne, no legend carved in gold. Just a man who had carried too much silence for too long and turned it into doctrine. Those who survived him changed, not into warriors, into watchers, listeners, the kind of Sith who waited, who breathed slowly, who let the galaxy burn loudly. While they studied the ashes, he never declared victory. He never marked the end. But if you listen very carefully, you can still feel the pressure in the places he passed through. Because his war never ended, it just became the silence we all forgot to fear. There is a world the maps have stopped naming. Its orbit decays a little more each year. Its sun bleeds light that barely reaches the surface. And beneath its crust, carved by forgotten hands, a chamber waits. Darth Chratis found it without searching. Not through coordinates or prophecy, but through pressure. The kind that pulls on the lungs before the mind. The kind that speaks without words. He stood above the fault line, alone, where storms never ended. The earth cracked in silence, and the way opened. No blast doors, no runes, just stone peeled back like skin. What lay beneath was not a tomb. It was something older, something that had waited too long. The air was thick with ash, but the flames had long gone out. The walls pulsed faintly, like veins beneath worn leather. And the force did not flow here. It collected, like a scream buried under centuries. He stepped through it all without pause, because legacy requires sacrifice. And he was ready to give anything, except himself. At the center of the chamber stood a circle, simple, unbroken, surrounded by nothing but silence. It was not a place for ritual. It was the ritual, a space where will had once carved reality, where voices had bled into the Force, and the Force had listened. He began to prepare, not with chants, not with scripts, with memory. He laid down fragments of all he had collected, a shard from Malachor, a blade once held by a Sith whose name had been erased, a thread of hair from a Jedi who had chosen exile over victory, and one final thing, the breath of another, Elden Axe. She did not resist. She followed him into the dark with steady steps. She did not ask why. She already knew. Because this wasn't a request. It was an ending. He told her nothing. She said less. But her eyes held the weight of something deeper than refusal. She had been shaped by his silence. Now she offered her own, not as defiance, as answer. He placed her in the circle, positioned each relic around her, and began the invocation. No words spoken aloud, only thought, only presence. The force bent, but it did not move. He reached into her essence, not to kill, to transfer, to thread his will through hers, so he could endure, so he could remain. But something resisted, not the ritual, not the force, her. She did not fight. She did not scream. She simply closed her eyes and waited, and in that stillness, the ritual unraveled, not violently, quietly, like a thread slipping from a needle. His breath caught, his focus dimmed, his hands shook, for the first time in decades, because she wasn't stopping him. She was denying him, and denial, when it's silent, cannot be undone. The chamber darkened, the air recoiled, and the circle at the center of it all cracked, not from pressure, from stillness. Chratis fell to his knees, not from pain, from something worse, realization. That power, without permission, becomes absence. And for the first time, he doubted, not her, himself. The chamber did not reject him. It waited. The cracked circle remained open, breathing slowly, as if the world itself was deciding whether he deserved another moment. Chratis rose, not in anger, not in desperation, in control. Because rituals did not fail, they only revealed truth. He walked the edge of the circle, feeling the pressure coil back into place. The relics trembled, not from fear, but recognition. They had been used before, long ago. When Sith believed legacy could be forced into eternity, those Sith were gone, but their mistakes remained. He understood now what the ritual demanded. Not sacrifice, submission. The old texts had lied by omission. They spoke of blood, of vessels, of binding spirit to continuation. But they never spoke of consent. Legacy could not be stolen. It had to be accepted, and Eldon Axe would not accept it. He approached her slowly. She did not look at him. Her breathing was steady, her pulse calm. She was not preparing for death. She was preparing for choice. He told her this ritual would preserve everything he had built, that his teachings would not fade, that silence itself would survive through him. She listened, then spoke, one sentence. If it lives through you, it dies with you. The words were not defiance. They were observation. Chratis felt something tighten behind his chest plate. Because she was right. A legacy bound to one will become a prison. He had built something larger than himself, and now he was trying to chain it. The chamber responded. The relics ignited one by one, not with flame, but memory. Images flooded the space. Sith lords screaming as their rituals consumed them. Spirits trapped in masks. Minds shattered across holocrons. Immortality, not as life, as echo. He had seen these things before, but he had believed himself different. Because he was quiet, because he was precise, because he did not crave worship. But the ritual did not care. It only asked one question. Are you willing to end another to continue yourself? Chratis stepped into the circle. The pressure surged. The world bent, and for a moment, it would have worked. He felt the force begin to fold inward, his will stretching beyond flesh, reaching for permanence. And then, Eldon Axe opened her eyes, not in fear, in pity, not for him, for what he was becoming. She did not resist the force. She removed herself from it, let it pass through her without anchor. The ritual searched for her presence, found none, and collapsed inward. The backlash threw Chratis across the chamber. He struck stone and remained there, breath shallow, vision dim. Not injured, humbled. The circle burned itself out, leaving nothing but fractured lines and cooling dust. The chamber fell silent again, but it was a different silence. Disappointed, he stood slowly. The ritual was gone, destroyed not by refusal, but by irrelevance. Elden Axe stepped from the circle, not freed, not spared, unclaimed. She looked at him then, and he saw it. Not rebellion, not triumph, independence. She said nothing more. She did not accuse him, did not challenge his authority. She simply turned away from the chamber and walked toward the exit. He did not stop her, because for the first time, he understood something the Sith had never taught. Legacy cannot be preserved by force, only by release. The dying world groaned above them. The chamber began to collapse, not violently, naturally, as if its purpose had finally ended. Chratis remained behind until the last echo faded, because something had been lost. Not power, certainty, and certainty, once broken, never returns whole. He left the chamber empty. No ritual, no binding, no immortality. Only the quiet understanding that what he feared most was not death, it was being remembered wrong. They returned in silence, not together, not apart, just walking the same path, in opposite directions. The descent had been heavy with purpose. The ascent was heavier with absence. He did not ask if she had learned anything. She did not ask if he had failed, because both already knew. The force felt thinner now, not broken, not wounded, just aware, as if it had watched everything and chosen not to intervene. Dromund Kaas greeted him with rain. It always did, but this time, it didn't feel like cleansing. It felt like reminder. The citadel loomed in the distance. The chambers he had once made cold now felt warmer, not because he had changed, because something inside the air no longer stepped aside for him. He walked its halls. Students paused, not out of fear, out of study, as if trying to see whether the shadow still followed him. He said nothing. He returned to his sanctum, sat where he always had, cross-legged, still, listening, but the silence did not respond. Not like before, not with tension, with observation, like a presence waiting for him to speak first. And he didn't, because he had nothing left to teach. He thought of Maltras, of the moment he had placed a hand on his dying master's neck, of how still the chamber had felt afterward, of the whisper, "Thank you." He wondered now if Maltras had known this feeling too. Not defeat, recognition. That legacy cannot be owned, only passed, and sometimes rejected. He remembered when Axe first knelt in the dark, bleeding, shaking, unbroken. She had not asked for power. She had waited for it to notice her, and it had. Now, she no longer waited. She no longer sat closest to the core. She didn't need to. The core followed her, because presence doesn't beg, it becomes. The students watched her differently now. She did not speak more often. She spoke less, but her silences were heavier than his. And Chratis understood what that meant. The shape of power had shifted. The ritual had failed, but not because of its design, because of its target. She had not destroyed it. She had simply been too complete for it to bind. Legacy cannot overwrite something already formed. Only emptiness can be filled, and she was not empty. She never had been. That was his mistake. He thought he had built her. He had only cleared the noise around her, and what remained was sharper than anything he had shaped before. He could feel the force choosing her, not in prophecy, in gravity. Even the sanctum breathed with her rhythm now. The students she touched walked slower, spoke less, carried silence with them like blades, and none of them called her master. They didn't dare, because something deeper than hierarchy had taken root. Not obedience, belief. And belief is harder to destroy than flesh. He watched her once through the reflection of a sealed holocron. She sat alone. No flame, no ritual, just stillness. Perfect, complete. He turned away before she could feel him watching, but he knew she already had. There was no confrontation, no betrayal, no final duel. That would have been cleaner, easier. But this was worse, because she had taken nothing, and still everything was shifting. He once thought silence made him a god. Now it made her a mirror, and gods cannot survive their own reflection. He stopped speaking, not as a choice, as a condition. The words no longer formed the way they used to. His thoughts arrived quieter, slower, like they were making room for something else. The students noticed. They always noticed. But no one asked, because the fewer words he used, the more weight they carried, until there were none left. He watched the temple change, not quickly, not loudly, just undeniably. The air in the sanctum grew colder again, but not from him, from her. Eldenax. She didn't claim the space. She filled it. Without intention, without announcement. The stone didn't resist. It adjusted. He saw the students breathe with her rhythm, stand only when she moved, wait longer before answering questions. Because her silence was no longer a reflection of his. It was its own storm. She returned from the tombs one night, robes soaked with rain, eyes calm. He met her in the sanctum. No words, no confrontation. She knelt once, only once, and when she rose, she did not bow again. Not from rebellion, from arrival. Chratis stood in the dark after she left, listening, waiting, but the force no longer leaned toward him. It balanced, and for the first time, he understood what survival truly meant. Not endurance, not conquest, surrender, not to weakness, to timing, because power never stays in one place. It moves, and if you hold it too long, it turns to weight. He left the sanctum the next morning, passed through halls where no one made space. Not out of disrespect, out of habit. They were following something else now. Not louder, just newer. He returned to the lower vaults, the oldest corridors, the ones that remembered his footsteps, and he walked them slowly, each echo quieter than the last. He sat where he once bled, where the stone still bore the heat of old pain, and he listened. Not for legacy, for peace. It did not arrive, but neither did regret. Because some rituals are not meant to succeed. Some are meant to show you what should not be repeated. He thought of the mask of a junta pole, cracked, forgotten. He thought of Tulak Horde's blade, long vanished. Of holocrons that no longer opened. Of tombs that did not keep their names. Even memory erodes, unless it's reshaped. And he was not the shape anymore. Elden Axe never claimed his title. She never asked for guidance, because there was nothing left he could give. She had seen the end of his path and chosen not to follow it. That, he realized, was the true ritual, the true sacrifice, to create something that would not become you, and still let it walk away. He stood one final time. No sabir, no flame, no voice. He passed through the threshold of the tombs without resistance. The doors closed behind him, not as a warning, as a release. And above, in the sanctum, she taught her first lesson. With silence, the students gathered around her, not kneeling, not bowing, just listening, because power no longer needed permission. It only needed presence. The chamber pulsed again, but differently, not with his weight. With hers, the ritual had failed, but something survived. Not him, not her. What was left behind? A lesson, a wound, a shape in the force that no longer needed a name, only a shadow, and in that shadow, the next story was already waiting. There was no warning, no shift in the force, no flicker of tension, only stillness. He had been standing in the sanctum again. The air held the same quiet weight it always did. The students had dispersed. Elden Axe remained behind, near the edge of the room, silent, as always. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to, because he felt something deeper. Not malice, not fear, something heavier. Finality. She stepped forward. He heard it. One footfall. Measured. Intentional. He turned only slightly, just enough to let her know he knew. And then the blade slid between his ribs. It was precise, clean. There was no rage behind it. No scream. No declaration of betrayal. Just breath. His armor cracked inward from the force of it. His knees bent, not from pain, but from surprise. It wasn't supposed to be now. It wasn't supposed to be her. And yet, it had always been her. The pain came slowly, not physical, existential. A wave of understanding that this was not a challenge. It was a conclusion. She held the weapon firmly. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything, because she didn't need to. He looked up at her. She didn't look down. He searched her expression for anger, for hate, for anything he could use. There was nothing. Not because she felt nothing, because she had already grieved. Long ago, when she realized what he truly was. A lesson, not a future. He reached for the force. It came, but slower than before, like even it was waiting to see what she would do next. His hand rose, the air cracked, and still she didn't move, because she had already decided. If he struck her down, it would be his legacy that failed, not hers. She didn't resist, but she didn't yield either. The wound she had given him wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to begin. He pulled the blade from his chest. Blood hissed against the stone floor. His breath was heavy but steady. He stepped back, and for a moment, the air between them held everything unsaid. Every lesson, every silence, every word he never gave her. Now she had returned it, with a blade. He remembered what Maltros had whispered so long ago. Thank you, and wondered if the words might come for him now. But they didn't, because he wasn't done. Not yet. He had built her, and now he would test her. The air thickened, his breath slowed, but his presence surged. She had cut him but not killed him. Not yet. And that, he realized, was her mistake. He moved faster than the wound should have allowed. The force clenched around his limbs, pushing his body beyond pain. His saber snapped to life, blood red and vibrating with fury. Not anger toward her, toward time, toward inevitability. She didn't flinch. She didn't ignite her own blade. She waited. He struck low, testing her center. She slipped back, not blocking, redirecting. He followed with a feint, then a crushing vertical arc meant to split her guard. The chamber flashed with crimson light. She moved like memory, not reacting, remembering. Every strike he had taught her, every flaw he once warned her to avoid. She knew them all, because he had shown her everything. And now it was coming back to him. In silence. His strength was still great, his speed formidable, but he felt the delay. In his shoulder, in his spine, in his lungs. Age does not announce itself. It simply lingers longer after each movement. And she was not tired. She was patient. He pressed harder, pushed her toward the central column. She ducked beneath a cross-cut, pivoted, and finally drew her saber. The clash echoed. Red met violet. For a moment, the force stilled. He saw it then. She wasn't trying to win. She was waiting for him to realize he'd already lost. Not the duel, the moment, because it was already too late. Her strike had ended it before it began. Now, they were only dancing with the ghost of what he used to be. Still, he fought. Because he was Sith. Because he was Chratis. Because when the body fails, the will remains. He twisted into a brutal sequence, Soken patterns, double feints, reverse footwork. She adapted, not copying. Refining. She caught his saber arm once. Just once. A graze across the gauntlet. Enough to burn. Enough to remind. He gritted his teeth and forced her back. A burst of lightning tore from his offhand, crashing into the stone. She rolled clear. The force recoiled, bending light across the floor. She rose without haste. Not injured. Not shaken. Watching, and still not speaking. Because there was nothing to say. This wasn't punishment. It was truth. He spun, drawing on every hidden reservoir he had left. The force screamed in his chest. The pain in his side was sharp, now constant. He felt warmth there. Too much. Too fast. Blood loss. She saw it. Did nothing. Because she didn't need to finish him. He was finishing himself. He lashed out in desperation. A final overhead strike, fierce, unrelenting. She met it with both hands. Their blades locked, faces inches apart. He saw her eyes. Still calm. Still waiting. And for a breathless second, he thought she might say something. But she didn't. Because this wasn't about him anymore. It never was. He broke the lock and staggered back. The fight was over. Not because he couldn't continue. Because she wouldn't allow it to mean anything. Victory would not be hers. It would be absence. She deactivated her saber first. Turned slightly. Not away. Just forward. And stood there. Letting him choose the next step. He did not attack. Because he understood. The fight had never been about skill. Or power. It had been about letting go. And he had held on too long. She never spoke the words. But they echoed louder than any cry for freedom. This was not betrayal. It was inheritance. He sat now, just beyond the threshold of the sanctum, breath shallow, blood darkening the folds of his robes. The cut she gave him had slowed, but it had not stopped. It wasn't just the wound. It was time itself unraveling inside him. She stood a few meters away, not advancing, not retreating, not claiming anything. Because this wasn't a coup. It was a return. She had not overthrown him. She had released him. And that, somehow, made it worse. He looked at her and saw no hatred, no hunger for his throne, no joy in his weakness. Only clarity. Like she had known all along that this would come not as a moment of triumph but necessity. The Sith code did not teach mercy, but it taught survival. And he had taught her to survive. Every silence, every withheld lesson, every time he made her bleed and watched her rebuild herself. He had mistaken it for obedience. But it had been something else. Preparation. The force around them didn't scream or resist. It didn't flare with conflict or tremble with prophecy. It only settled, as if the galaxy had exhaled. He tried to speak, but there was nothing left to say. Nothing she didn't already know. She had seen through him long before this moment. Not through his lies, through his limits. He thought about the day he first saw her bloodied in the arena, defiant and wordless, her gaze fixed on the impossible. He had believed he could shape her, and he had, just not into himself, into what came next. And now, she stood exactly where she needed to be, not above him, not below him, just beyond him. He reached into the Force one last time. Not to strike, not to rise, but to remember. The tombs of cars, the whisper of holocrons, the sound of his own voice echoing in forgotten corridors. He had tried to preserve himself, to stretch beyond flesh, to leave behind a voice, a presence, a scar deep enough to resist erasure. But she had undone that not by fighting it, by becoming what he never could. Present, whole, unafraid of vanishing. He realized now that legacy isn't built through domination. It's built through release. Letting something you made walk away. She moved closer, slowly, carefully, not out of caution, out of respect. And then, for the first time in their lives, she knelt beside him not as apprentice to master, but as one truth beside another. He met her eyes. They didn't ask permission. They didn't need it. They simply waited. And in that stillness, he felt something old and unspoken pass between them. A farewell, not spoken, not performed, understood. She placed his saber beside him. He did not take it, because he didn't need it anymore, and neither did she. This was not her rising. It was his ending, not in fire, in silence. She stood once more, not quickly, not slowly, just completely. And when she turned and walked away, he did not watch her go, because he already knew the future no longer needed him in it. Only the lesson he had become. He remained seated long after she was gone. Not because he couldn't move, because there was nowhere left to go. The halls no longer waited for his footsteps. The shadows didn't bend toward him. The echoes of power that once obeyed his breath now passed him by like strangers on a road once traveled. Time had done what enemies could not. It had taken everything without ever raising a blade. The sanctum above no longer whispered his name. The students did not search for him. They followed her now, not because she asked them to, but because she made them believe there was still something worth following. He had believed in fear. She believed in focus. He had carved silence out of pain. She wore silence as a promise. And the difference was enough to end him. Not through defeat, through disuse. The Force did not abandon him. It released him. His breath came shallower now, each inhale a little slower than the last, not from pain. That had long become background. It was the weight of letting go, the body forgetting how to hold on. His mind drifted back to voices. Maltras, Feradun, Eldon. Each one had come to him with fire in their veins. Each one had left without needing to look back. He wasn't angry. He was tired, because in the end, it wasn't power that consumed him. It was purpose. He had poured every truth, every cruelty, every secret into the vessel of his legacy. But the vessel had moved on, and he was still here, alone. He closed his eyes, not in sorrow, in surrender. The force pulsed one last time through the stone beneath him. It didn't carry anger or fear. It carried memory of everything he had built and everything he had lost. He felt the cold finally reach his chest. Not sharp, just full. The kind of cold that doesn't threaten, only finishes. His final thought wasn't of conquest, or pain, or even her. It was of stillness, a kind he hadn't known since before the first scar, before the first kill, before the title of Darth had ever touched his name. He had tried to defeat time, but time had never fought him. It had simply waited. And now it claimed what was always its. Not with fire, with quiet. Outside, the temple stood unchanged. The sky above Kars was gray and endless. Students moved through its halls, calm, focused, listening. The chamber below remained sealed. No alarms, no mourning, because they knew there was nothing to mourn. He had not been stolen. He had returned. To the dust, to the stone, to the force. A memory carved into a place that no longer needed his voice. And above it all, Eldon Axe stood beneath the central arch, her eyes closed, her breath even. She didn't speak of him. She didn't repeat his lessons. She simply taught what time had given her. And so the legacy survived, not as doctrine, but as silence. And in that silence, the name Darth Chratis became what all Sith must. A shadow, not feared, not followed, but understood, and finally, let go. No alarms were raised. No temple was sealed. No great tremor raced through the force to signal his end. He died quietly, somewhere beneath the surface of Dromund Kars, in a chamber no longer marked, on a stone floor long abandoned by the living. No one saw it happen. Not truly. There were whispers among the acolytes, the archivists, the masked figures who passed one another without names. They said Darth Chratis had vanished, that he no longer taught, no longer walked the perimeter of the sanctum, that the students had begun listening to Eldon Axe instead. But no announcement came, no funeral, no procession, no body, just stillness. And in time, the questions stopped being spoken aloud, because fear is louder in silence. The Dark Council, if they knew, did not care. Or perhaps they did, but no one dared to ask. They had seen Sith rise and fall for centuries. They had buried legends and raised monsters. One more shadow passing into the stone walls of the Empire meant nothing. Unless it hadn't passed at all. There were rumors, not from soldiers or spies, but from those who lived on the edges of the Sith's forgotten places. A merchant who dealt in old relics claimed the holocron he kept behind his shop would no longer activate. Not broken, just quiet. A Sith scholar reported that the temperature in the tomb of Ajunta Pol dropped 5 degrees the moment the name Chratis was spoken. A scout on Yavin the Force said the Force had gone still near the ruins of an old ritual chamber. No wind, no birds, no presence. Like something had paused the land itself. No one connected these stories at first, because no one wanted to. But the pattern emerged, piece by piece. Not through evidence, through unease. The kind that doesn't warn, only watches. Eldon said nothing. She moved through the temples with grace and silence, not claiming titles, not correcting whispers. She taught what needed to be taught. She answered what needed to be answered. But never the question that everyone feared most. Where is he? The students who had seen her last walk into the sanctum knew something had happened. She came out different. Not wounded. Not changed. Resolved. Like someone who had finally finished a conversation that lasted years. She still carried no saber. Still taught without anger. But now, when she passed, some swore the shadows followed her just slightly. Not like fear, like memory. And in those quiet corridors, the rumor became legend. Darth Chratis had not died. He had become something else. The kind of Sith who transcended death not through resurrection but through ritual. The kind who didn't need a body to be feared. Some claimed they saw him. Not clearly. A figure in black armor at the edge of the karst jungle. A reflection in the metal walls of a shuttle hangar. A voice in a forgotten holocron that called a young acolyte by name. But each story unraveled under scrutiny. Nothing held. Nothing proved. Only fear. Because it wasn't his presence they feared. It was his silence. A Sith Lord, once so obsessed with control, now reduced to myth, or worse, ascended beyond it. Eldon Axe never corrected the stories, because she understood something deeper than death. She had seen the moment he passed. She had watched him exhale not with rage, not with hunger but peace, a rare thing for their kind. He had been many things in life. Master, tyrant, seeker, but in death he had become what he never managed while alive. Still, and in that stillness he became more powerful than any title could contain. Not in the Force, in the minds of those who remembered him, and those who feared they might see him again. Across the ancient worlds of the Sith, the change was not announced. It was felt. In the valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, the winds shifted direction without reason. The tomb doors did not open, yet the air inside grew colder. Acolytes reported that the statues seemed heavier, as if the stone itself had remembered something it wished to forget. On Ziost, the old shrines dimmed. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply quiet. The chanting chambers where Sith once meditated for days no longer responded. Holocrons that had whispered greed, rage, and ambition now sat dormant. Their glow faded to dull crimson, like embers after a fire had chosen not to return. The priests blamed decay. The scholars blamed time. But the Force knew better. Because this was not decay. It was recognition. The old Sith had always responded to echoes, to strong wills, to those who carried the shape of memory forward. And Darth Chratis had been one of those shapes. Not because he conquered worlds, but because he listened to the dead. He learned their pauses, their regrets, their unfinished thoughts. He had walked their tombs not as a thief, but as a continuation. And when he died, something ancient noticed the absence. On Malachor, the broken spires fell silent during meditation cycles. No visions came, no screams, only darkness without direction. Some claimed the planet itself was mourning. Others believed something worse, that the dead Sith were listening again, and choosing not to answer. In one forgotten shrine beneath Dromund Kars, a group of initiates attempted a binding ritual meant to awaken ancestral guidance. The circle formed correctly. The chants were perfect. The blood was offered. Nothing happened. The force refused. Not violently, politely, as if the ritual had reached out and found no one willing to respond. The initiates left shaken. Because Sith rituals were never ignored. They were punished or rewarded, but never dismissed. Elden Axe was informed. She did not investigate. She did not summon the priests. She did not order the rituals stopped. She simply closed the shrine. And when asked why, she said only, "Some doors close themselves." No one argued, because deep down, they felt it too. A pressure that once hovered in the background of every Sith world was gone. Not lifted, gone. The kind of presence you only notice after it leaves. Like the sound of breathing in a dark room. You never hear it stop. You only realize you are alone. The older lords sensed it first. Those who had survived long enough to recognize cycles. They remembered moments in history when something similar had occurred. When Marka Ragnos died, when Naga Sado vanished, when power shifted without violence, those moments did not end eras. They bent them. And now, the bend had begun again. Some Sith attempted to claim Chratis' memory. They wore his colors, spoke his teachings, quoted fragments of his silence as doctrine. None of it worked, because he had never taught with words. And silence cannot be imitated. Those who tried felt foolish. Those who persisted felt hollow. Because what made him powerful was never transferable. It was presence. And presence cannot be stolen, only remembered. In the deepest vault of Korriban, a caretaker reported that one of the oldest tomb seals had cracked. Not broken, opened slightly, just enough for air to pass. When questioned, the caretaker could not explain why he had gone there that day. Only that he felt watched, not threatened, observed, as if something old had looked up and realized something was missing. The Dark Council met privately. No minutes were recorded. No decisions announced. But afterward, the temples grew stricter, the training harsher, the silence enforced. Because fear grows fastest when meaning disappears. And meaning had vanished with him. Darth Chratis had not been the strongest Sith, but he had been a stabilizing absence, a gravity well. And now, without him, the ancient shrines did not know whom to listen to. So they listened to no one. And that silence, that refusal, echoed louder than any scream. It began as a shadow in passing. A reflection in a Durasteel wall on Drummond cars. Someone walking alone in the rain saw a second figure beside them. But when they turned, the walkway was empty. A week later, an acolyte claimed she had seen a Sith in black robes watching her from the cliffside outside the archives. Not standing, hovering, masked. No one believed her, until others began to see it too. Always at the edge of things, always still, a shape that resembled him, not perfectly, not fully, but close enough to make the heart freeze, because it wasn't the face they recognized. It was the mask, the same one Darth Chratis had worn in his last year's plain, featureless except for the narrow cut across the eyeline, a symbol of nothing, and somehow, that made it worse. Symbols offer meaning. This offered only memory. One apprentice saw the mask in her sleep. She awoke choking, not on fear, on grief. Another claimed he heard footsteps in the old sanctum at night, slow, even, armored, but when he checked the surveillance logs, no one had entered. They began calling it the face without breath. A joke at first. Then a warning. because wherever it was seen, things stopped working. Doors locked, lights flickered, holocrons refused to open, as if the force itself was recoiling from the presence. But what truly unsettled them was this: the figure never moved, never attacked, never spoke. It only watched, and in that stillness something unbearable settled into the hearts of those who remembered him. The possibility that Chratis had not returned, but that something else had returned wearing him. Not resurrection, not survival, a memory pretending to be a man. One lord ordered a full sweep of the sanctum. Droids searched for days. No footprints, no DNA, no tampering. Only an old datapad left on the altar, blank, except for one sentence. Nothing dies that was never named. The Lord retired the next day, vanished into the outer rim. The council said nothing. They could not afford to look afraid. But deep within the archives, Eldon Axe read the reports, one by one. Each sighting, each whisper, each shift in the air. She never denied them, because denial is for the unsure, and Eldon Axe knew. She had seen it begin. She had watched him collapse. She had closed his eyes. And yet, there were nights when she meditated alone, and felt it too, a chill in the stone, a pulse that did not come from her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sorrow. It was weight, the feeling that something was standing just behind her, not waiting, witnessing. And when she looked back, nothing was there. Nothing she could see. But something remained. She returned to the chamber where he had fallen once, alone, quiet. The marks on the floor were still faintly there. Dust had gathered in their edges. The altar had cracked. The lights no longer worked, but the shape of the ritual circle remained. She knelt inside it, not to repeat it, to understand it, and in that silence she realized what had gone wrong. The ritual had not failed. It had never been meant to succeed in the way he believed. It was not a spell. It was a mirror. He had poured himself into the Force not to become immortal, but to become remembered. And the Force had listened, not with approval, with indifference, because the Force doesn't grant legacy. It echoes it. And the mask, the shape, the presence that lingered, wasn't him. It was the echo of everyone who feared him, hated him, or followed him. Their memory had shaped the shadow. Their silence had clothed it. And their fear kept it alive. She left the sanctum and sealed it behind her, not to bury the past, but to stop it from growing. Because some echoes become louder than voices, and some masks never come off. Eldon Axe did not speak of him again, not in council meetings, not in private gatherings, not even to herself. His name, once feared, once whispered like a curse or a prayer, vanished from her mouth completely, not out of fear, but out of finality. Because the most dangerous Sith are not those whose names echo. They are the ones whose silence becomes structure. And she knew what silence could build. She oversaw the closing of his old chambers, the archives he once guarded, the vaults he had sealed, the relics he had stored, the holocrons he studied. She did not destroy them. She archived them, wrapped in layers of encrypted codes, hidden behind false paths, catalogued under different names. Not lost, but unreachable. Because some truths do not serve those who find them. She understood that now. What Chratis had tried to do, the ritual, the binding, the attempt to stretch his will beyond the limits of death, it had not made him stronger. It had made him linger, but not in the way he wanted. Not as a Sith Lord remembered in legend. As a question. a figure that stood too still in too many places, a name that refused to vanish because no one dared to confirm it was gone. That was the cost of legacy pursued without end. It did not inspire. It haunted, and she would not let him haunt her. Not anymore. The blade that ended him had been a mercy, but the memory, this slow, creeping distortion that followed, was the real wound, and it could not be treated with fire. It could only be starved, so she erased the signs. She rewrote council records that bore his signature. She replaced the accounts of his final teachings with redacted files. The holocron labeled Chratis Doctrine was renamed Unknown Variant Incomplete. She changed nothing of the truth. She only let it blur. Because clarity is a kind of light, and some things should remain in the dark. She trained no new apprentice. She made no claim to his legacy, because she had never been his continuation. She had been his ending, and endings do not lead. They close, but that closing came slowly. The galaxy did not mourn him. It did not notice. Planets spun, wars continued. Jedi hunted Sith, Sith hunted each other. And somewhere in the chaos, a man who once called himself Lord vanished from memory. Except for the few who still felt the cold when they entered the wrong room. The few who, in quiet hours, turned too quickly, believing someone stood behind them. They spoke of him like a myth, a figure of warning. Don't seek too much, don't listen too long, or he will find you, and say nothing. The mask became legend, and in time, legend became something else. Not fear, not truth, just story. And that, more than anything, was what Eldon wanted. For him to become harmless, not because she hated him, because she had loved him once, not the man, the idea, the vision of strength shaped by silence. But now she knew better. Silence is not strength. It is weight, and carried too long, it becomes a prison. He had never escaped his. He had only passed it on, and she refused to wear it. So she walked alone through the rain. No guards at her side, no holocams tracking her. Past the cliffs where his mask had once appeared. Past the sanctum door sealed so tightly even the Force seemed to avoid it. And she did not look back, because some echoes beg for witnesses. And she would not give him that, not anymore, not even in memory. She whispered one final word into the storm, not to him, to herself. Enough. And for the first time in years, the wind did not answer. It only moved on. They didn't speak his name in the temples anymore, not openly, not with respect. The Sith don't mourn their dead. They study them. And when a name becomes too dangerous to say out loud, it becomes something else. A shadow. A lesson. In the deep corners of Korriban's lower tombs, the acolytes were taught about many ancient Sith lords. Some were monsters, some were gods. Some ruled for centuries, others for days. But none of them came with a warning, except one. Etched into the wall of a collapsed corridor, words scorched into stone by someone long forgotten. There was no title, no history, only this. Do not become what he was. No name, but they knew who it meant. Darth Chratis. To most, he was a myth. To others, a whispered failure. A Sith Lord who tried to live beyond death and vanished in silence. His teachings weren't banned, but they were left to rot. His holocrons placed on shelves no one was told to study. His mask, if it still existed, sealed behind doors that opened for no one. But the dark side does not forget, not truly. It waits, and Chratis had not been the kind of master who allowed time to bury him without resistance. He had studied rituals beyond Sith law, pulled secrets from relics even the Dark Council feared, and walked alone into places where the Force itself trembled. Even in death, or what passed for death, there were signs. There were dreams. Across Dromund Kaz, Force-sensitive children began waking in the middle of the night, their breath held, their eyes wide with fear, not fear of pain, not even fear of death, fear of recognition. They would describe seeing a face they had never known, but somehow remembered, a mask of deep iron and old anger, a voice that didn't shout, but pressed into their minds like cold stone. When masters at the academy began noticing patterns in the dreams, some believed it was the echo of trauma. Others thought it a trick from rival houses. But one woman, older now and quieter, spoke only once. Elder Nax. She said, "It's not him. It's his shape. The fear he left behind." And then she refused to say more. She didn't confirm his death. She didn't deny it. But her silence spread faster than truth ever could. It created a myth more powerful than any record. And that was the most dangerous kind of Sith legacy. Not power, not conquest, uncertainty. What do you do with a Sith Lord who might still be watching? Acolytes started testing boundaries. Some dared the old rituals, the broken paths Chratis had walked. They thought it would make them strong. It didn't. Some vanished, some turned on each other. One was found kneeling in the temple courtyard, his eyes hollow, repeating a phrase in a language no one recognized. They burned that section of the archive, said it was corrupted. But it wasn't the archive that was broken. It was the memory. And memories don't stay buried, not in the dark side. Not when they've tasted ambition. There was something haunting about the timing. Darth Chratis had never ruled empires. He had never stood on a throne world. He had no great fleet. And yet, decades after his death, more Sith spoke his name in fear than they did of lords who'd commanded legions. Because Chratis didn't die like a Sith. He ended like a wound, unseen, unhealed, unnamed. And the only warning he left behind was this: if you chase legacy too far, you won't find immortality. You'll find a mirror, and it will show you something you're not ready to see. Something that was once him, and could soon be you. There were places on Dromund Kaz where the lightning didn't strike. Places too old for nature to interrupt. One of them was a hollowed crater far beyond the capital ruins. No path led to it. No maps marked it. But sometimes, late at night, Force-sensitive wanderers were pulled there, drawn by nothing they could name. Some returned, changed. Some didn't return at all. Those who did said it felt like standing inside a thought that wasn't theirs. A whisper trying to remember its voice. It was here that something lingered. Not a ghost, not a presence, but a feeling. The air moved slower. The wind didn't echo, and every stone seemed older than the world around it. If you reached out with the Force, it pushed back not with rage, but with memory. Darth Chratis had been gone for years, long enough that the galaxy had moved on. New wars, new Sith, new enemies. But the Sith Empire, fractured and bitter, had never truly healed from within. Power had shifted hands, secrets had changed owners, but fear had remained loyal. And that fear still followed his name. They didn't speak of him in the open, but in private, the apprentices whispered about the shadow without a master. A presence they felt in moments of doubt, when their ambition faltered, or when the dark side grew silent. They said his legacy had unmoored itself, slipped loose from time and flesh, and now drifted like smoke through the cracks of weak minds. But the truth was simpler. He had shaped too many, burned too deep. The rituals he pursued had not given him immortality, but they had given him imprint. And imprint is a dangerous thing in Sith tradition. It doesn't fade, it waits. Every acolyte trained by Elden Axe carried it, even if they didn't know his name. Her silence had not severed her from her master. It had made her his vessel. In her teachings, in her pauses, in the way she chose not to answer questions his influence endured. She never spoke of his final moment. But those who studied her long enough noticed the weight she carried, the way her eyes paused before every lesson, as if remembering a mistake. And maybe that was the lesson. Not power, not conquest, but restraint. Still, restraint is not the way of the Sith, and that made the shadow of Chratis more seductive. He represented what many of them feared they might become, but also what some quietly hoped to be. Not a Sith Lord remembered for titles, a Sith Lord remembered in silence. One young apprentice, clever, precise, hungry, once asked Elden Axe if legacy was more important than victory. She did not answer. She only turned away. That apprentice was found dead 3 days later. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just the mark of scorched stone beneath him, black lines forming an ancient symbol, one that hadn't been seen since the days of Darth Chratis. They buried it in reports, labeled it a force accident. But the archivists knew, and some began sealing certain texts again, hiding holocrons, removing his name from search paths. But it was already too late. He had no tomb, but his image had become one. He had no heirs, but his legend was multiplying. Darth Chratis had vanished, but the dark side had not let him go. It never does. Not when someone leaves that kind of mark. Not when someone teaches pain to listen. And so, a new kind of Sith began to emerge. Not louder, not stronger, just quieter, more patient. The kind who walked alone, who asked different questions, who studied not for glory but for the truth behind fear. They didn't know it, but they were his children. The shadow without a master was growing again, and no one could stop it. Some said Darth Chratis had no face, only the mask. They weren't wrong. Over time, even those who feared him had stopped picturing his features. What stayed with them was the cold design of his mask, sharp, impersonal, staring. A face made to judge. And for those who reached for power without understanding consequence, it judged harshly. The mask was never recovered. At least, that's what the records claimed. But rumors moved differently. Rumors said the mask was seen again worn by another. A Sith Lord whose voice did not match, whose posture was wrong, and yet, something about his silence felt the same. He did not command with noise. He didn't boast. He just stood still, and the room changed. Like Chratis had. The Sith archives never confirmed if the relic was real. But they didn't deny it either. Because denial, in Sith politics, is another form of fear. And fear has always been contagious. That was how Chratis survived. Not through bloodline, not through teaching, but through fear passed like inheritance. Acolytes who studied his few remaining records often changed afterward. They grew quiet, more focused, more withdrawn. It was as if reading his history showed them something in themselves. A mirror, one they didn't know they were looking for. Because Chratis wasn't the monster in the dark, he was the dark they were becoming. Every Sith thinks they'll stop before the edge. That they'll master the Force without letting it master them. That their vision will be different, controlled, strategic. That they will be the ones to rewrite the rules. So did Chratis. He studied holocrons not for power, but to prevent others from gaining it. He manipulated the council not to rise, but to stop others from falling. He trained Eldon not for loyalty, but for survival. And every decision he made, every ritual, every silence felt like control. Until it wasn't. Until legacy became addiction. Until purpose became ritual. And that's what they saw in him. Not just what he became, but how he got there, slowly, quietly, intentionally. Every small compromise layered like ash on skin until nothing was left underneath. The mirror doesn't lie, and that's what made him terrifying. He wasn't a mistake, he wasn't an outlier. He was logical, patient, predictable, and still, he lost himself. So, what did that mean for them? What did it mean for the ones who felt anger too clearly, who buried guilt too deeply, who read his words and felt seen? Darth Chratis was not the most powerful Sith, not the most famous, but in the end, he became the most personal. Because his story didn't stay in holocrons, it stayed in their thoughts, in their doubts, in the quiet questions they didn't ask. Would I do the same? Have I already? It wasn't his rise that made them fear, it was his path. How close it felt, how understandable, how human. That is the secret the Sith do not speak aloud. They are not monsters. They are reflections. And Darth Chratis, more than any other, became the reflection they feared most. The one that didn't scream, didn't rage, didn't fall. He drifted, and never returned. Eldon Axe never spoke of him again. Not to the Sith, not to the spies who followed her, not to the few students who once asked what had happened on that dead world, far beyond the outer trade routes. She only looked at them, calm and unreadable, and then she walked away. There was no grave, no ashes, no monument, nothing to touch, nothing to bury. But the absence was loud. It rang through abandoned corridors of Dromund Kaas, where the lights still flickered in rooms that hadn't been used in decades. Through old Sith training halls where acolytes sometimes paused, unsure why the air felt heavier. They didn't know his name. Not fully. But they felt him. It wasn't a haunting. It wasn't a ghost. It was something quieter. A pressure. A breath held too long. A presence just out of view. Because Chratis had not left behind teachings. He had left behind choices. Echoes of them. When a Sith made a decision that cost more than expected, they sometimes whispered, Chratis. As if naming him was a way to soften the guilt. To turn mistake into pattern. Pattern into fate. As if he were the price, not the warning. But Eldon knew better. She carried his silence differently. Some say she became more careful after his death. Others say she grew colder. But those who truly watched her noticed something else. She paused. Before orders. Before anger. Before certainty. It was small. But real. As if she'd seen something at the end that could not be unseen. Not his face. Not his fall. But the last flicker behind his eyes before the final breath. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was recognition. That he had finally become what he feared. Not dead, but forgotten. Not by others, but by himself. He no longer remembered who he was before the armor, before the rituals, before the mask. He wasn't sure the man ever existed. Only the Sith remained. That was the legacy Eldon carried. Not in her hands, but in her memory. She didn't speak his name again because she didn't have to. It had already become part of the galaxy's subconscious. A lesson disguised as myth. A story that whispered not beware but look closer. And many did. Some avoided it, some studied it, and some followed it, step by step. thinking they could walk further without breaking. They were wrong, because Darth Chratis was not an end. He was a pattern. He was the moment you believed purpose excused cruelty. He was the breath before silence became isolation. He was the power that asked nothing until it asked everything. And even now, deep in hidden shrines across the stars, his shadow lingers. In the pauses, in the quiet ambition, in the students who believe they are different, but the Force remembers. And it does not forget those who tried to reshape its will, especially not the ones who tried to make their name echo forever, especially not the ones who almost succeeded.